Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. As I already said, I'm happy to see some familiar faces. Always nice. So I don't know if you see my smile, but I see your smile. So yes. So today is a very special Spark, I would say. One of the reasons mainly is organizational wise, as normally our monthly Sparks tend to welcome always one of our CIBP members expert. We have done rounds with Brazil, with France, with Belgium, with Austria. And this time we thought it is the opportunity to introduce to you a special Spark about China's new normal. Uh, there's someone that I have an echo. Okay. And the the special spark about China's new normal, I think it's important to share it with you. Why? Because when I had this exchange with Pascal Coppens, present with us today, it opened my eye on the reality that we have and we believe in, and the reality that exists in in another part of the world. And it has a huge impact on how we approach not only life, right, the Chinese philosophy, but also how we spark and treat topics like innovation, leadership, and where we have a mission and where we want to go ahead. And I would think that for our cooperative business model, I think it's important always to combine what is the philosophy and the economical and strategic purpose. So with that, I will give the floor to Pascal Coppens. Welcome, Pascal. Thank you again for accepting, for being with us today and to host this Spark. And now I think that with all our colleagues, we will be curious to hear not only about you, but also your passion about China and how you see and what you have learned with your experience, more than 30 years experience in China. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. It's a pleasure. I'm honored to be here, and I hope I can contribute some of my insights that I've acquired during the last 20, 30 years dealing with China and working in China. I'm going to first try and share my screen. Let me know if this works. If Can you see the full screen?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, just to double check. And then I'm going to put this on full screen. Just 1 second. Now it's full screen, I hope. Okay, good.
Yes.
So I would like to talk a little bit about China's new normal and basically how China has started to set the standard for innovation. But not just innovation. I do believe that if we look at our new normal, which we're always talking about, which we hope will come now or should come now post-pandemic, I think looking at China's new normal from before the pandemic is a good place to start. So I'd like to take you all along to 30 years ago. This here, that was me 30 years ago. I was young, naive, beautiful, like the landscape back then. And I traveled through the country for 2 months. I did this twice, 4 months in total. I really enjoyed these travels. But one of the first things that I truly experienced when I went to China was the fact that actually there were still a lot of poor people. There were 754 million people living below the extreme poverty line. And I took a lot of pictures back then, as you can see, and China was extremely poor back in 1990. This is only 30 years ago. And in those 30 years, China has taken out every extreme poverty out of the country. Now, extreme poverty, that means about $2 a day, $60 a month. That's not a lot of money. And so this is a real miracle which happened in just one generation time. What happened is that hundreds of millions of Chinese, they went to the factories to build the products that we love so much everywhere around the world. Of course, they didn't build this for us. They built it for their family, their child, their parents, and the people that they trusted, really. But the question that we never ever ask ourselves is, why did China become the factory of the world? Because if it's about countries with a lot of people that are still quite poor and want to work really hard for a better life, why not India? Why not Indonesia, or maybe somewhere in Africa like Nigeria, or why maybe in Latin America, Brazil or Mexico? Or I mean, there's so many places that could have become the factory of the world. But China did. And I think it has to do with three specific reasons that is quite unique to the Chinese culture. The first one has to do with their coordination skill. That means that Chinese, they love to be an expert, a master, the number one in one domain. And then they want to pass this along to the next one, who again wants to be a master and expert in his own domain. And this, of course, in factories, in production, is very useful because everybody wants to be the best. But it's also the collective mindset of the Chinese that when they trust each other, people around them, and they trust their leader, they really can go very, very fast into one direction and all together in that same direction. But one thing that I have experienced in China, why I believe China really became the factory of the world, is because of the creativeness and inventiveness of Chinese. And I'm sure some of you will say, now, Pascal, what are you saying? Chinese being creative? Come on, they're copying everything, they're stealing stuff, and ultimately they'll learn everything by heart at school. So why would you say Chinese are creative? But give Chinese a problem, and they're the best pragmatic problem solvers in the world. They really like to solve puzzles and complicated situations. And this, of course, in production is constantly something that you experience because there's always delays in products, there's quality issues, there's payment issues. This is really the issue that Chinese love to solve. And so this is why in just 20 years' time, actually China became the factory of the world. 20 years ago, 80% of all the countries in the world were actually doing more business with the US than with China. Today, it's the reverse. Today, what we see is that we have become dependent on the Chinese factory of today. And that has to do with this collective mindset, this coordination, but also the pragmatic creativity that the Chinese have. What that means is that by 2030, approximately, because economists don't always agree what the year will be, actually China should be bigger than the United States in terms of pure GDP in total. And that means that within the next decade, China will become the biggest economy of the world. And we need to take that into account whether we want it or not. Now, what also happened is that people who didn't go to the factories, they went to the cities to build the cities from scratch. A city like Shenzhen did not exist 40 years ago. It was a fisher village. Today, 20 million people. If you look at Shanghai, it doubled its population in just 30 years' time to build the most beautiful skylines in the East. And there's 100 cities and more in China. If you would go back 30 years ago, when I was there the first time, you wouldn't recognize the city at all. You wouldn't find your way anymore because the city has transformed so much. What that means is that China became not just a complete new modern environment, but it's also the biggest consumer market on the planet. But I always say it's not just about numbers, it's also about quality. Actually, the Chinese are becoming the most sophisticated consumers in the world. And what that means is that they're very demanding, very impatient. They always want the best thing, even the best quality, something they would produce the worst quality, but they want the best because they know what quality problems in China means. And so if you want to launch new products, launching it in China is actually quite useful because they are usually the early adopters of the world. They want to take the risk for some use trying out something new. Of course, what also changed is the middle class. Today, China has 230 million families. That's about 600 million people that belong to the middle class. That means that they have the same standard of living as, for example, the middle class in Western Europe or in America, North America. But that also means that there's still 800 million Chinese living in poverty. They're not extreme poor anymore like before, but they're still poor. And so what Xi Jinping wants to do, what he calls his common prosperity in the next 5, 10, 15 years, because that might be as long as he will stay on, he wants to take as many possible poor people into the middle class of tomorrow, into the Disneyland of the middle class. This little video here that you can see is a video that was taken 2.5 years ago after the lockdowns in Wuhan. And what you can see is that Chinese are not lining up at budget stores like Primark or Aldi or, no, they're lining up at Cartier, at Chanel, at Gucci, at L'Oreal, at Lancôme, at all these luxury brands because there's so much money in China. And that is the real new China of today. What really changed China, in my view, in 2008 was the transformation digitally. because that is the moment where 3G license of telecommunications were made available. And so every Chinese who could buy a smartphone bought a smartphone, and they jumped over the PC era, they jumped over the telephone and went straight to mobile. By 2018, 10 years later, 98% of all the Chinese on the internet were on the internet with a mobile phone. China is a mobile-only, mobile-first country. And that means they're seriously addicted to their phone. I mean, it's much worse than everywhere or anywhere else in the world. And the reason for that is because already for 14 years, since 2008, every application that was built in China was always built mobile first. And the result of it is that people were really glued to their screen morning and night. Now, from time to time, Chinese ends up in a fountain, but of course, China would not be China if they wouldn't be able to solve these problems. So China is building its digital path towards the future. And from now on, we can be confident that it's safe to walk the streets of China or Shanghai, Beijing with your cell phone. But more importantly, if we want to understand our digital future of tomorrow, looking at China's digital past of yesterday is actually a good place to start. This little girl here, 5, 6 years old, is buying some candy with her smartwatch as if this is the most normal thing in life. And this woman here, she expects you to take out your phone, scan her QR codes. If you take out your wallet or give her some cash or a credit card, I guarantee you she just starts laughing. It happened to me. It happens to most Chinese, most foreigners that visited China for the very first time. But this is already the old normal. The new normal today is about face payments. So going to a convenience store, going to a market, going to maybe board a plane or go to on the subway or get something from a vending machine. You just smile, you scan your face, and everything's paid. This is all about convenience. It is about speed. It's about ease of use. Now, this is what it's all about. And this has been enabled by what we call super applications. Alipay being the face payment system of China, but also besides just payment system, they have all the financial services. They have social platform on that application. They have millions of merchants on there. And on top of that, and that's the most important, they have all the live services. What that means is that you can top up your mobile phone or pay your utilities or go to the movie and buy tickets with it. And that means that you will visit this application every single day, maybe 10 times per day, because it's useful for your daily life. And every time you get confronted with financial services. The most famous, of course, of all the super apps is WeChat from Tencent. And if you don't know it, I mean, this is the biggest app in China. You have to have WeChat to do business in China. But it's not the amount of apps that are available in this application that is important. It's the fact that they all work together in one ecosystem, which means you can start combining applications. So if you have social media and you have e-commerce, you can make it social commerce. If you have social media and retail, you can make it social retail. Combine gaming with maybe live streaming, or combine maybe a hospital visit with taxi booking or car sharing booking. All that is possible. What's interesting is that that allows us to actually create contextual data about the user behavior. And that means that we can have much better data, much more valuable data that can actually unleash artificial intelligence to make sense of it all. And this is the reason why China became the #1 e-commerce country in the world, with, before the pandemic, already 40% of everybody in the world buying online being a Chinese. And that hasn't changed much post-pandemic. Now, one other reason that China became the e-commerce country in the world has to do with the shopping festivals. And I want to give you some idea of how that happens, because this is not just about buying online in a festival to get discounts. This is a real experience, and it's about very interactive. It's about live streaming. It's about gaming. It's about virtual reality. Now the metaverse, all these things are connected with it. But what's interesting is that this festival, which the biggest one, and there's about a dozen of them, festivals in China, shopping festivals, online shopping festival. The biggest one is Singles Day on November 11th, so just a few days ago. Now, I don't have the numbers yet for this year, but for last year, we had Alibaba, who created Singles Day, sold for 550 billion renminbi, which is 84 billion US dollars. And its competitor, JD.com, or Jingdong in Chinese, the Amazon of China, sold for 40 billion. So together 114 billion US dollars sold in just one shopping festival like Black Friday or Amazon Prime. And if you sell for 114 billion US dollars in goods, that means you have 4 billion packages. Now, as you can see, 4 billion packages, it's a lot of packages. But Alibaba and JD were able to ship all these packages in only 40 days' time. 40 days. By New Year, everybody over the whole China, as large as Europe, got his package. Now, I'm from Belgium, and in Belgium we have the Belgian Post, and we're very proud of our Belgian Post. They ship about 500,000 packages a day. During the pandemic, that was the maximum that they could cope with. So I thought, why don't I calculate if the Belgian Post would have to ship 4 billion packages from one shopping festival in just the small country of Belgium? Well, I can tell you, the last person would have gotten his or her package after exactly 40 years. 40 years as opposed to 40 days for the exact same thing. This shows you the difference in speed and efficiency between China and Belgium. But of course, if you see those packages, you can't imagine how they do it. But that's because we're seeing the front end. If you look at the back end, you see all these robots. And today, China is more automated and robotized than Germany, America, and South Korea together. Now, not all these robots are operational yet, but give it a few years, and actually, China is more robotized or as automatic in its factories as a country like Germany. And this is what we need to look at, not the hands, but actually the automation. But the problem is if you ship for 4 billion packages, you also have an ecological issue. I mean, all these packages, that creates a lot of waste, but on top of that, CO2 or carbon is emitted into the atmosphere. And so 2 years ago at the General Assembly of the United Nations, Xi Jinping said very clearly, he promised that by 2060, China will be carbon neutral, CO2 neutral. And by 2030, it should peak on CO2 emissions. Now, many people say, yeah, but the Chinese are saying that, but are they really meaning it? And they're still opening coal mines. And what does that all mean? But if you look on the ground and you really see what's happening in China, there's no country that goes so close to the transformation that is happening on the ecological point of view. I mean, they're the biggest producer end user and consumer of renewable energies. Everywhere in the country, there's infrastructure. If you look at green trees or trees that they've been planting over the last 40 years, today it's 23% of the whole area of China is green. It used to be 12% 40 years ago. Now, if you look at this picture on the left bottom, what you see is these are all the electrical vehicle charging station points in a small district of Beijing. This is a picture I took at State Grid, which is the biggest utility company in the world. And in 2019, when I last visited China, just before the pandemic, there were actually already more than 1 million EV, electrical vehicle charging stations. Today, it's more than 2 million. And this is why 53% of all the electrical vehicles in the world are sold in China, because the infrastructure is there. And if you go to Shenzhen, you see every bus, every taxi, the whole public transport is become electrical, and the city has become very silent and nice to live in. And this all changed in just 5 years' time. But if you look at the finance part of it, this is what really is driving this transformation. Today, the green loan balances and the green loans offered to companies to actually invest is actually bigger than anywhere else. Today, the big four banks, the ICBC, the ABC, Agriculture Bank of China, the Construction Bank of China, as well as the Bank of China, if you see what happens is that they are doing almost 30 to 40% of all their loans are green loans. And all the commercial banks are following as well in growth of commercial green loans as well. The biggest change, however, that China underwent started in 2016. This is 6 years ago. And that's when Xi Jinping said by 2030, in 8 years from now, China will become the leader in global innovation. And this, of course, created a lot of tensions with the United States, with Washington. It started with a technology war on Huawei and ZTE, and then it became a trade war under Trump. Later on, I mean, it was really a tug of war in every possible aspects. And today, the chip war is the most prominent available today. And so this is really big tensions. Now, just a few days ago, Xi met Biden at the G20, and it seems these tensions are getting a little bit better, but actually it still feels very much like it is a very big war still ongoing. And that has everything to do with China that was actually challenging the US to take the #1 in terms of innovation, in terms of transformation. But China is not doing this just to actually want to take the number one or place number one. They're doing it because they have to solve the problems in the country, which are huge. And this is why 6 years ago, China decided to focus on disruptive technologies. These nine specifically were the ones that China wanted to be the leader in innovation, because every one of these innovations and technologies are actually disrupting every business model and every industry in the world. And so China didn't want to catch up with the West. They wanted to leapfrog ahead of the future, or head into the future with these disruptive technologies. And if you look today, 6 years later, what you see is that China is already leading in all nine of these categories, specifically if we look at the implementation of them into society. But only 10 years ago, we were convinced that China would take at least 20 years to become innovative, and maybe 100 years or never ever catch up with the West. While these same magazines today are talking about this technology supremacy race between China and AI on all nine of these aspects, all nine of these disruptive technologies. And the question is, how is it that we got this message so wrong? Is it because we don't believe that other people in the world can innovate as well? What is behind that thinking? Now, this is why in 20 years' time, the last 20 years, China went from almost not visible to become a superpower economically, military, politically, and made all the progress in terms of innovation, technology, high tech, and patents that they could only have dreamt of. And this means that after 20 years, China now, since a couple of years, is starting to look what their purpose would be for their own population in the future. And this includes taking many poor people into the middle class. But it's also looking far out into space and seeing how far they can go. This is the reason, because this all happened in 20 years' time, that Chinese, most of them, trust their government. And this might sound very strange, but this survey done by an American company called Edelman, actually they do that every year, shows very clearly that 91% of the Chinese in that survey trust their government. While in the US, for example, it's 39%. And so what I did a few times is I showed this survey to a few of my Chinese friends. I have many Chinese friends, of course. And I show this, and then the reaction is always very interesting, because they say, well, if you in the US don't trust your own government, we truly cannot expect you to trust ours in China, can we? And so they just continue going on, trusting that actually the Chinese government is maybe taking the right path. But at the same time, the negative perception towards China has really increased. Today, we can talk about 80% of all the people in Western countries having a pretty negative perception about China. And someone like Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State under Trump, said it very clearly: we cannot trust China anymore. And this image that we probably all saw after the 20th Party Congress, where the standing committee, or the 7 most powerful people in China, were chosen, or at least elected or selected, and all loyal to Xi Jinping, we felt that this is not the right direction that China is going. It is going about more control, about more isolation, maybe going back in time. This is why we don't trust China anymore. And we have all the proofs that actually confirms this. If we think about the lockdowns, and we think about how difficult it is to revive the economy and how the economy is hurting. But also big problems that China has. Think about the real estate, pollution, the geopolitical tensions, but also demographic problems, the debt problems. I mean, there's so many problems that China has to cope with. And so we believe that this bubble in China is about to pop. It's probably going to burst. But I've been watching China for 35 years, and I can tell you, for 35 years, every year, there's a magazine somewhere in America that is writing that next year will be the year that the bubble will pop. But still, it hasn't popped. And so the question is, why is this bubble, with all its problems, not popping? And I think the answer is a little bit in how we view China. We're viewing it and asking ourselves the question, is China going up or is China going down? And this is a binary question. And the problem with binary questions is that you expect a binary answer. But why cannot China not go up and down at the same time? This is a very typical, quite Western way of thinking. It has to do with our culture, our history, our religion. It has to do with science. It has to do with our enlightenment that we had from the past, which in Asia is much less. And there they're thinking much more in terms of and instead of or. This is what I call the qubit mindset. Don't just think it's one way or another way. It's maybe both, or maybe we just have to analyze or wait until we see whether it's A or B. And this is about more contextual thinking. And this is not just China. The whole Asia is like that. Most of the Asian countries think much more, not in binary way, but actually in things that are contradictory that could work together. And this is why Asian leadership and Chinese leadership is really the leadership that we have to learn from, because thinking and really helps us in times of unpredictability. This is about trust. It's about trust in the future, but also trust in the people around you. And this is something that Asia, with the relationship culture that Asians have, is very, very important. But it's also about the way that they think cyclical. And I think we're always looking at up or down, but actually that's not the right way to look at China or most countries in Asia. We have to look at moments of control and moments of letting go of control, moments that are tough and moments where there's a lot of opportunity. And now we're probably in a winter, but that winter is of course going down, and it's a slippery slope, and we might have some challenges, and China realizes that more than anyone. But that also means that they're taking care of many of these problems because they expect that after the winter there's a spring coming. Well, we don't believe in that spring as much anymore, and maybe in the next 10 years many economies in the world indeed will not grow, but China intends to continue going for spring. Actually, China is a country of constant change. And for me, the only constant in China is change. And so in business context, if you understand that change is something to embrace and to understand, then you understand why these Chinese companies are surviving against all odds. For example, Huawei, if we take one as example. And there's two things that the Chinese do extremely well to embrace this change. And this has to do with infrastructure and with agility. And the first one is something that Chinese do very well. And we all know that. There's a Chinese saying which is hundreds of years old, which goes like this: Yao Xiangfu Xian Qiu Lu. And what that means, I assume you don't speak Chinese, so what that means is basically if you want to become rich and wealthy, you first need to build a road. And so Chinese have been building the Great Wall and lots of roads and high-speed train, more than the whole world together. And I mean, they're building, even outside of China these days. But today, it's much more about the digital infrastructure. And so 2 years ago, the Chinese government decided to invest 1.4 trillion US dollars in this 5-year plan up to 2025 into the digital infrastructure. And if we take, for example, 5G as an example, to make sense of that amount of money, that was decided in the previous 5-year plan, which ended in 2020. And in that plan, they said by the end of 2020, we want to have 500,000 5G base stations installed in the country. The real number they had was 700,000. They exceeded their target. And the US at that point was 50,000, 50. So 15 times more than the US 2 years ago. China was already the most connected place on the planet on that scale. But the problem is this is infrastructure, and it's cool and nice, but what does this mean? If we really want to understand what it means, we have to go and look below the waterline and look what the transformation and the disruption that it entails. And the biggest disruption that happens is actually not the infrastructure, but the applications that are built on top of the infrastructure. So in 2017 and 18, because most of the Chinese innovators and many of my friends knew that actually by 2020, the 5G network would be there, they started building 5G applications like self-driving cars, remote surgery, telemedicine, or remote mining with millions and millions, sometimes a billion users at this stage. And this is really the difference. It's about the applications because you expect the infrastructure and you're convinced that the infrastructure will come. But the other thing is about the invisible. We're looking too much to the visible. If you look at the invisible, these disruptive technologies like 5G, AI, blockchain, central bank digital currency, and so on, you've heard about all these things, are so much being implemented in society that it makes the cities much smarter than before. And China has more pilot smart cities than any place on the planet. It's also creating complete new smart logistics, which is going to make it simpler, easier, faster, and cheaper to do cross-border trade and import-export with China. But they also want to become the green factory, not just the factory of the world. And so that means the green products of tomorrow. And for us, every country in the world, to achieve our climate goals, we will probably be forced to buy the green products from China, or we won't reach these goals because that is their aim. And when it comes to finance, China is really changing all the rules, going completely into a digital environment, not just with mobile payments, but with central bank digital currency, with complete transparency through blockchain and other ways that they have built huge infrastructure, which is changing the way that countries and inside the countries are now dealing with each other. Very interesting topics. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is about agility. And I've been an entrepreneur for 15 years in China. I've worked in China for 20 years. And I can tell you, competing with Chinese innovators, it's really, really tough. But where do you find talent in a world where actually you have to find real good engineers to do the innovation? Well, a good place to look in China for talent is at a job fair in Shanghai. I've been there one time. I can tell you this is madness. You don't want to go into a job fair in Shanghai. After 5 minutes, I was out of the door because I wasn't looking for a job. I was actually looking for candidates, but you don't want to go there. It's insane. But the reality is that every year, 11 million people are graduating from university every single year. And out of these 11 million people, almost half of them, this was a graph done in 2017 when there were 10 million people, almost half of these 10 million, 4.666 million to be exact, did graduate with a science, technology, engineering, and math degree. All engineers. And so when people challenge me and say, can China really become the leader in global innovation? I always say, look at this graph. There's smart people everywhere in the world. It's just China has more of them. And then you add India to that. And then you add some other countries in Asia to that. And it's clear that the future of innovation, the future of new intellectual property is going to come more and more from the East, whether we want it or not. But what Chinese innovators really like is to look for what we call red oceans. And red oceans, as opposed to blue oceans, which is about creating new markets with new products. Think about Airbnb or Uber or Apple. They're creating new disruptive ideas and everybody follows them after. This is blue oceans, but red oceans are existing markets. It's a market where there's a lot of customers, a lot of money to be made, a lot of opportunity, a lot of downloads. It's an existing market, and the only thing you need to do is to differentiate in that market. And Chinese innovators, they love to go into existing markets. But that also means you have to constantly adapt to that market. And so I don't call this a red ocean, I call it a bloody ocean, because it's a bloody gladiator fight to the death to survive in this red ocean. And the only way to survive in this red ocean is to be agile. And this is something you learn in China, because if you don't do it, you're actually not surviving. And this is why we can learn so much from what I call survival leadership from China, specifically in these unpredictable times that we have today. But it's also about speed, and Chinese love speed. They call it China speed. And I believe you can never, ever beat Chinese in speed. You can beat them in many things, in branding, in marketing, in technology, in innovation, in strategy, in project management, whatever you can come up with. But in speed, they're usually always faster, specifically when there's a lot of hurdles to overcome. And one of the main reasons that they're faster has to do with the culture. 2,500 years long, Chinese were embedded in a culture of Confucianism. And one of the 5 big virtues of Confucianism is this character, which is called Xin. And Xin means trust. And so this is all about trust. And despite the fact that China finds trust the most important word in the Chinese culture, we don't really trust China. But this has to do with trust into the relationships and into the context and network that you have. Confucius even make a quote out of it. He said, it's more shameful to distrust our friends than to be deceived by them. This is going very deeply, which means that you first need to create that trust. And once you have that trust, you can actually go twice as fast as all your competitors, because it's based on trust. And this is what I call my 8 circles of trust. In order to do business with China and become faster together with Chinese, or become faster in general, you have to go into the smallest circles as possible. The bigger circle that you are in, the more difficult it is actually to deal with that speed and that trust. Now, Chinese are also addicted to speed. And here's a few examples. Here on the left top, what you see is a railway station that has been built in just 9 hours time, 1.5 kilometers with 1,500 people. 1,500 people took less than a day, half a day, to build a complete new railroad because the high-speed train would not have to stop in the morning when it arrived. We all heard about the two hospitals in Wuhan, COVID hospitals that were built in just 10 days time, imagine. Or this here on the left bottom, you see a hotel, 57 stories being built in 3 weeks time. And there you see how they're building these high-speed trains from one pillar to another to put a beam over these beams. It really goes very, very fast. They're addicted to speed. Now, the question you could ask us, you could ask me, is really like, okay, if they are addicted to speed, how about quality then? I mean, quality must not be very good. And the answer is yes, the quality is usually very, very bad. But the second time they do it, it's better. The third time is better. By the 10th time they've done it, it's actually almost the same, maybe better quality than most places in the world. The only thing I can recommend you is never ever stay in a hotel in China that was built at this speed for the very first time. But besides that, they're addicted to speed. And Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, once said that in the future, in that new normal, that new world of tomorrow, that is actually not going to be the big fishes eating the small fishes, but the fast fishes eating the slow ones. And Chinese are extremely fast, but more important than being fast is that they like to work in alliances. They like to collaborate. They like to co-create. They like to work in what we call ecosystems to share things amongst the people that they trust to actually eat the big fishes and actually make sure that they survive. And this is an ecosystem thinking, which if you look at Alibaba, it's very clear how they built that over the past 20 years. These are some of the products from Alibaba. It's just a short list. And what you see is that for every product that Alibaba has, actually in the West, we have one big competitor that is the market leader. But the difference is that they stick into their own industry. They don't go cross industry. They don't cross the lines. While Alibaba and most technology innovators constantly cross. And the reason is if you cross, you can share data between these entities. And on top of it, you can actually get much more context of it. And it also allows you to follow the user journey, which is not possible for many of the other companies. And so to conclude, I would like to say that I think the strength of Western brands and global brands is really about building intellectual property. The best products in the world have been built in the West and in general outside of China for 100 years sometimes. We've also built the best services and we know exactly how strategies should work. I mean, companies like McKinsey have made a business out building strategies for companies. And we are addicted to efficiency, to performance. We want to improve everything. Specifically, if you look at Germany or Switzerland or the Swiss watches, for example, they love to have everything working like a clock. But at the same time, we have made our brands very big and very important because consumers and clients have an emotional connection with the brands that we have built. But if you look at the future, speed is becoming more important than intellectual property because everything is becoming open. Everything is about collaboration and co-creation and things are getting shared. But on top of it, the world is changing so fast, you have to change with it. And you also need to stay more reliable or rely more on the ecosystem than on the strategy. Because anybody who made a budget in 2019 probably threw that away in 2020. If you made plans just before the invasion of Ukraine, I'm sure you changed these plans when it comes to energy needs. You can't rely on the strategy anymore. You need to rely on the ecosystem to be agile because agility is becoming much more important than the efficiency of the process because everything is constantly in flux. And the most important is you need to learn to look, or we need to learn to look more at the market, at the consumer, at the client, because our brands may be the biggest in the world, but being big is not as important as understanding what the market needs. And these things in yellow is really what Chinese brands are very, very good at. And so I believe if we want to understand our new normal for tomorrow, we need to keep the strengths that we have in the West, our Western brands, or anywhere in the world, but we should learn from what the Chinese brands have made themselves quite unique. And if we combine these two things, we'll have the best of both worlds. And this, I think, should inspire us to really look at our future by looking at China's past to understand how things are changing. But it's moving so fast that we actually can't wait too long to look into China and to put our radar back into China after 3 years of lockdowns that we really haven't watched the country very much. And with that, I want to conclude my presentation, and I will give the word back to Valeria for question and answers.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pascal.
My pleasure.
The pleasure is ours, I would say, because as I wanted to share with our audience today, it's really eye-opening and also with a lot of humor, and it does us a lot of good. It takes away the preconception and the fears we might have about China. So thank you about that. We have some questions on the chat for everyone present today. Please write also your questions on the chat or take the word with no hesitation. I will start reading the two first questions that popped up. One from Raoul from Canada, Desjardins. China has a large percentage of its population in senior age. How have you done with this segment of the population to educate them digitally?
Okay, it was a great question. I actually think this is where China is doing something that very few people know, is that they force technology companies to make it easy for older people to access digital products. And so many products like WeChat or other products, these technology companies will make like bigger buttons and bigger screens, and they will make it less steps to do things so that the digital population or the older population can actually join faster into this transformation. But on top of it, there's also a cultural aspect, which I think is very interesting. And the cultural aspects is that the Chinese young people, the younger generation, so the children and grandchildren, are really helping their grandparents to get within the digital transformation. And so, for example, if you look at Singles Day, most of these purchases that were done are done by young people, but they're done on behalf of the whole family. And so they're buying like toilet paper for 6 months for the whole family. And so this is how they get really great prices. So I think that the mindset is that within the family relationship culture, they're trying to change it. And then the government is kind of forcing the technology companies to make it easier to do that transformation. I hope that answers your question somehow. Okay, great. I think you're on mute, Valeria.
Yes, true. Thank you. And then we have another question coming from Adriano in Brazil. The question is, how important was the Chinese political system for this revolution?
So that's a very big question. I think there's been books written about the political system and the reforms that they have done. And I think we have to look at different times in those last 30 years. So there was the opening up of China with Deng Xiaoping in 1978. This was all very hopeful and everything was possible and everybody could get rich. And then it was about growth, 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 and more, and work harder, harder, harder. This was the rat race of China in the beginning of this century, and everybody worked like crazy, me including. Otherwise, you would not survive in this country. But then suddenly it created by-effects, corruption, ecology problems. I mean, the demography is an issue. The one-child policy was an issue. I mean, lots of issues that basically created the huge debt of China, the real estate bubble, and so on. And so this is the second part of this growth. And the third part is now where actually China realizes the challenges and the problems ahead, and they're trying to actually stand on the brakes a little bit and make sure that it doesn't pop this bubble. And this is where China, specifically the financial system, in tandem with the political system, has a lot of means to actually direct the future, which we have in the West a lot less. I mean, we can use different methods and different models with interest rates and so on. But in China, they have they can actually tell the banks what to do. And so especially the state banks, which means they can guide and direct somehow what the direction is. And the direction today is really to make sure that this poor people still belong, get into the middle class more and more. And so that it's more, I wouldn't say definitely not an equal society, but that the top rich and the top poor are just less. And this is about more a common society. And so this is where the political system and Xi Jinping is going in that direction. The mistake we cannot make is to assume that that this is targeted towards actually killing technology, killing innovation, or killing change, because this is exactly the opposite of what I'm seeing on the ground. And the opposite of the goal is just that because the very rich are the first one targeted in this new policy, we often get that translation wrong. The reality is they want the innovators and the entrepreneurs to be more, and more people to work together. So I think this is a very different way of thinking. But I don't know whether China will succeed. That's another question. The only thing is that if they succeed, we're going to have a population of 1 billion people in the middle class, and that's not nothing.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the explanation. Again, don't hesitate to write your questions on the chat or to raise your hand if you want to ask a question. I see your question, Uwe. Is there a cultural difference between China and Taiwan?
It's a very good question, very dangerous one. But that's okay. So I've made a video on YouTube for 55 minutes about Taiwan. So if you ever have another hour, you can actually go and look on my YouTube channel. The reality is that Taiwan is a very complicated situation when it comes to China. And so culturally, of course, the past is very similar because most people living in Taiwan are actually Chinese ethnic. And that means they have the same Confucianist culture as people living in the mainland. What has changed, of course, is that since 1996, which isn't that long, it's like 25 years ago, Taiwan became a democracy, and they became different in ways of thinking politically. And this is where specifically when the DPP, the Democratic Party in Taiwan, took power in 2016, which is only 6 years ago, the mindset completely changed about how they saw their future. And they see their future similar to their past, but with different ways of thinking about rights, specifically human rights and political systems. And so this is very difficult to marry with the Chinese mainland political system. But this is all only 6 years ago. So if you would have asked me this question 10 years ago, I would say it is very similar. But today is very different. And specifically because of what happened in Hong Kong, with actually the last years, where Beijing has really been involved into trying to stabilize this city in sometimes very forceful ways, then the Taiwanese are now very much wanting to go their own path, and that is creating a disruption. But the problem here is, and this is what I explained in this video, the problem here is that both geopolitically, culturally, historically, and militarily, China can almost not let go of Taiwan without risking its own development to stop. And that is the reason why it is geopolitically such a time bomb that is one day going to explode if we keep pushing Taiwan for independence. If not, we hope that it will go peacefully, but we don't know when. So I think it could take 50 years if we have patience, but nobody knows.
Yes, I think that there's also two other good questions that I will read to you. One is also regarding our business model, a question coming from Brazil. Are there credit unions in the Chinese financial system that you know of, Pascal?
Credit unions?
Credit unions, so cooperative banks, credit financial systems.
So I would, yeah, so there's a lot of commercial banks that are working together. If you're asking if the shareholders are also the employees and the participants, that is something that I'm not yet aware of. I do see it in businesses. For example, Huawei is a company completely owned by the employees. Now, there's definitely some banks that also go into that direction, but because the banks in China are over-regulated, quite regulated, I think this is a new model that is maybe a little bit too early yet, but it is an answer I'm going to owe you in the past. I'm going to do some research for that. But in business, yes, you see it a lot. Xiaomi, the cell phone manufacturer, I mean, there's lots of collaborations and cooperations, and you see more and more that companies want to share, specifically young companies, want to share the profit and the benefit of the future with their employees because they understand that the talent is what makes their future. And so this is very different from before, where talent was really just workers and basically they just had to execute. Now it's about creation. And as you create more, you have to collaborate more. In the finance sector, I'm sure there's things happening, but I see it more in environments like blockchain environments and so on, not crypto, but blockchain and technology fields than I see it in the bank sector. But I'm going to do some research on it and give you that answer later.
Great, thank you. We have two questions still, if everyone has still some time. First one coming from France, from Julien. Pascal, how and when do you see a China international reopening? Seems now Chinese are living in the same Europe was living in the early 2021, with COVID contamination increasing massively.
Yeah, if I could put a date on when China will fully reopen, I would probably become a billionaire overnight. So I'm not sure I can give you an exact date. The only thing that I've seen is that since a couple of months, and specifically the last weeks, is that China's constantly testing new ways of trying to loosen the strict dynamic COVID-0 policies and opening up again. And so they went from 3 weeks quarantine to 10 days. Now it's 8 days, and it's airplanes can now, international flights can now go back into operations. And so everything is getting loosened. What they're doing, and this is typically the cyclical thing of China, they're touching the stones under the water and trying out things. Certain cities, they're letting go a little bit. The problem with that, and that's the challenge that the local governments have, is they're having a conflicting direction from Beijing. One direction says, you really have to try out things to see if we can actually get rid of it. The other directive is, if you actually are creating a situation where there's massive infections, then you're probably going to lose your job. And so this is a very hard balance for most of the governors in China. Do I want to go one way or another way? And so you're seeing that often they still choose for the safe way to put cities quick in lockdown because they rather not lose their job than actually take a risk for the economy. And that depends on the state of these cities. Every city is different. But what they're doing is they're trying to understand how this will improve. And I think in the next months to come, we're going to see a lot of change happening. The biggest issue, in my view, is the lack of vaccines and the hospitals that could not cope with millions of people flocking to the hospitals to get serviced if they have COVID. And so vaccines, they're now in the third phase of their own mRNA vaccine. And so this means they're getting there to vaccinate specifically the older population. There's one more thing I want to add to that, which is quite interesting, which few people know, is that most of the old people don't want to take vaccines, not because they're Chinese, but they don't trust Western medicine in general. And they trust actually the Chinese traditional medicine much more. And most people believe that the traditional Chinese medicine is great for COVID or against COVID, and means that they think, I'm fine, I'm safe. And so that, of course, doesn't help the whole situation.
Thank you. Thank you. There is a last question before we close, I would say, coming from our colleague. This week, there was the G20 summit in Bali. It's also very current and political. It seems that Xi and Biden are on speaking terms again. What do you think we can expect for the future?
So this is a great and very current question, because I mean, Xi and Biden, every time they spoke over the past 3 years during the pandemic, every time after that, we had the feeling they were on speaking terms. And 2 weeks later, we saw the opposite reaction happening from the US, and then China reacting double as hard sometimes after that. And so, is this time it's going to be real? I think the big difference now is that we're out of this pandemic, most of us. And so we can look at the world differently. We're living a little bit less in fear, except for the war, of course, in Ukraine. But that means that we are looking at a different world in itself, and that companies need countries like China for purchasing products, for markets, for selling into the market. They need Asia, and China is embedded in that. So our perspective has changed a little bit. What we've also seen is that this is a first real face-to-face visit after 3 years. And dealing with Chinese on Zoom or on Teams is not the best way to create a good relation with Chinese. And so I think this is definitely helping. And you've seen that also not just with Washington, also with Australia, with Germany. China is starting to have more of a dialogue again. And I think if this dialogue becomes more frequent every so many months, and this seems to be happening since Bali, we can expect at least that the tensions should go down a little bit. But I don't think the perception of the West, specifically United States and Europe, towards China is going to change because of this meeting. I also don't think the Chinese are suddenly going to say, oh, now everything's over and we are going to reboot. But the reaction on social media in China, and that's interesting to watch, was pretty positive after that meeting, which means most Chinese were saying like, oh, finally, we can actually try to put a floor again and start again building. And so this, I think, from a Chinese perspective, gives a positive sign. But as I said before, things seem positive, and then 3 weeks later, they sometimes turn differently. So you only need one incident to change it all.
Very, very interesting, and maybe not that reassuring, but that is life, right? In uncertain times.
Yep.
I would like to close then our session of today by warmly thanking you, Pascal. I think, and I hope that everyone understands why we felt it was important to invite Pascal today for this Spark. I think it's really eye-opening, and I hope it has triggered you on you at your work, your relationships with your colleagues, what triggers innovation. It's also the opportunity for us to promote also the next CIBP Link Espresso workshop. It's an e-workshop, and in that moment we have a workshop planned with Pascal in February. The workshop will be on leadership, on trust, on innovation, and also with the colleagues of the CIBP network. You could trigger maybe some collaborative ideas. So that will be, I will be sending some promotional material about that if you want to register, or if you want to promote this within your teams, within your colleagues, within the different department that may be benefit from this mindset, from this way of thinking. Please do register or contact me directly. Thank you very much again for being with us today, Pascal. Warm thank you, and who knows, we will hear more from you next year. Thank you very much
Okay.
again.
Okay. Thank you very
Bye.
much. Bye, everyone.